We are now just 2 weeks away from the U.S. presidential election, and both candidates are zeroing in on a handful of key battleground states. As Katie Simpson shows us now, while Trump went on the attack, Harris campaigned with a longtime Republican. In battleground North Carolina, Donald Trump entertained supporters for more than an hour, insulting his Democratic challenger,
She's a mess. She's a cognitive mess.
relying on his familiar dehumanizing language about migrants.
They make our criminals look like really nice people. These people are so much more vicious. They cut you up and they don't even think about it the next day.
As he toured the swing state, visiting hurricane-ravaged communities, he repeated the false claim the Biden administration diverted relief funds away from storm survivors.
They've spent it on illegal migrants. Many of them are murderers. Many of them are drug dealers.
The Trump campaign continues to harden its tone, defending threats of
What?
military force against U.S. citizens and labeling political opponents as the enemy within.
And I think it's totally reasonable for the president to point out that, yes, we've got the strongest country in the world, but we do have some broken leaders in Washington.
Democrats hope some moderates and even conservatives are tiring of the rhetoric. And so Kamala Harris teamed up with Republican Liz Cheney to try to appeal to voters hesitant about Trump.
And I would just remind people, if you're at all concerned, you can vote your conscience and not ever have to say a word to anybody. And there will be millions of Republicans who do that on November 5th.
The unlikely pair visited 3 swing states, underscoring what they see as the stakes in this vote.
In many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man, but the consequences of him being president of the United States are brutally serious.
Donald Trump admitted he's not seen anything to suggest the outcome of this election would be unfair, though he again repeated the lie the 2020 election was stolen from him and accused Democrats of being cheaters. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
The thing with Cheney being there, it's the Bush-Cheney era neoconservatism and this Biden-Harris era of neoliberalism. On the surface, if you're not totally astute to the dynamic, they may appear different in rhetoric and policy focus, but like they share a significant overlap in terms of material interest, particularly in how they support the broader agenda of American corporate power, right? You'll never see a neocon that's going to be anti-immigration, right? Because if you're anti-immigration, then you're like anti-cheap labor. The neocons don't want to crack down on immigration because that's where their fucking cheap labor comes from. That's where their exploitation comes from. That's where the servant class comes from, right? Because you're able to give more treats to more people who are multi-generational, landed from here, multi-generational settlers. And then that way you use this servant class because the conditions where they're from are so bad because of us. And so then the people who can vote and the people who have an actual say, more and more as that gap becomes bigger, more and more people have access to capital because of globalization and open markets. But rather than the people in power getting to the people who have the say of what they're going to do with that power, rather than them trying to do something for good, they're being bought off by the treats, and the treats keep the status quo. So there's always this thing with neoconservatives where they're like this libertarian progressive in a way with their domestic policy, right? They'll give huge tax cuts to the rich. They'll give big tax cuts to the rich. They're still going, like Cheney's fucking sister is a lesbian, right? They're still progressive. It's just that they're super hardcore pro-capitalist. It's like Ford, right? Like it's like that Reaganite conservatism, and it falls right in line with Harris Biden. Harris would be, if she became president, she'd be the first president since Reagan to be out of California. And it's that same base of people. And it's because they've been now shifted so far away from the Republican Party that they're now all going to back a Democrat, and then they're not any different, right? Neoconservatism under Bush and Cheney was exemplified by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was heavily focused on expanding American hegemony through military intervention. It was driven by the belief that the U.S. had both the right and responsibility to reshape other nations to align them with democratic ideals, or at least to create the favorable conditions for what would be American interests. And this approach is military Keynesianism, right? It's fueled enormous government resources into the military industrial complex, benefiting defense contractors like Halliburton, who has ties to Miss Cheney's father, former President Dick Cheney, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. This global war on terror under Bush and Cheney justified this increasing military spending, which in turn stimulated profits for private corporations involved in this military and security economic infrastructure. The Biden-Harris administration, by contrast, operates with a more veneer of progressivism, but they have more technocratic tone to themselves, and they emphasize free markets and globalizations and a return to multilateralism. After the Trump years, neoliberalism focused on these like market-based solutions to policy challenges, and the deregulation and privatization and reduced government intervention in the economy, which is no different than the neoconservative baseline that the Bush era had. It was just like the same, that where they overlapped was in their fake progressive politics of being pro-immigration and stuff like that. But this still all is meant to sustain a commitment to American global hegemony and American global leadership. Under Biden, military spending has continued to exceed previous spends, right? With initiatives like AUKUS, the submarine deal, and the ongoing involvement in global conflicts like the fucking ongoing genocide in Palestine that the U.S. is funding and handing weapons hands over foot to Israel, which is feeding that Keynesian military economic structure, not to mention Ukraine, right? And so it's showing this continuity with the military strategies of the Bush administration. The key overlap between these two ideologies lies in that shared commitment to maintaining an economic geopolitical dominance of the United States. It doesn't matter what, it's like a realpolitik thing, right? It doesn't matter if it's seen as progressive for the neoconservatives, and for the neoliberals, it doesn't matter if it's seen as conservative. They meet in the middle because it's all about what the best way to extract capital and to remain as the global hegemony, right? So both of these sides prioritize the needs of these large multinational corporations. That's why neocons are pro-immigration, right? Particularly in the sectors like defense, energy, and global finance. And during the Bush-Cheney years, it was the invasion of Iraq. This was that justified need for the fight against terrorism because of 9/11 and the underlying interests related to controlling Middle Eastern oil and those energy markets. Similarly, you look at Biden-Harris, that neoliberal White House, while less overtly hawkish, they still protect their military interests, particularly through international trade agreements and policies that prioritize corporate profit over labor rights or environmental sustainability, not to mention the fact that they're funding a genocide and then also funding an endless war that cannot be won in Ukraine. And so like Biden's support for NATO and NATO's strategic initiatives, including arms sales and maintaining alliances against rising powers like Russia and China, this shows this continued dedication to defending American corporate and military interests. And then additionally, both administrations demonstrate an inclination to promote U.S. influence through international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And it's these, like what they're doing, how they were able to get Ukraine into the global market, not by getting them into the EU, but by setting these individual free trade agreements with all these countries. It's through these types of deals and these institutions that push these neoliberal reforms into what was, former backwaters that are now developing nations. It encourages privatization into these countries that had a hold on their development. They were not going to develop in an unsustainable way. That's the reason that things like the Ukraine war happened. Both sides needed to get in there because it was a untapped market as far as resources, land, all of those things. And with accelerated privatization, deregulation, and austerity policies that throughout these areas that they're targeting, the more that they're expanding into these areas, they're doing it in this way that's like making the conditions so bad that you have to go and work for pennies. But then that is seen as globalization. That is seen as the free market, because they're coming into this market that people have been obliterated from any type of relationship with capital. So then any type of relationship with capital is going to be seen as better than it was previously, and they'll pat themselves on the back for it, right? And that this is how America looks to expand into new markets, by going into regions that are untapped because of their deals with places like China or Russia they couldn't get into, right? And so under Biden, it's this emphasis on that global trade and investment opportunities, which look at Biden's connections to Ukraine and companies in Ukraine. These investment opportunities connected to these politicians closely align with the exact same goals as the Bush-Cheney era administration, which sought to open these new avenues for American capital across the globe, in Afghanistan and all of those other Central Asian nations. And so the overlap between the Bush-Cheney era neoconservatism and the Biden-Harris era neoliberalism is most evident in their shared material interests, right? Both administrations focus on reinforcing American corporate power, ensuring global military dominance, and sustaining the capitalist framework that allows the United States to maintain themselves as an economic superpower, albeit through different ideological justifications. The neocons will always appeal to the moderate progressive, because they are pro-capitalist, but have that veneer of, we're not as crazy as Trump. And then the neoliberals will, this in the opposite way, like neoconservatives appeal to neoliberals because they are more capitalist oriented in their policy and ideology, but they still have that like progressive veneer. And then neoconservatives admire neoliberals because they know that they're just capitalist bloodsuckers, but then they're able to put on that veneer to make them look like they're socially progressive. So if the neocons are able to associate themselves with these progressive figures, like how many times did we see Obama and Bush, those dudes hanging out and things like that, right? They're trying to, the same thing that they're doing right now, how Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris, right? They're trying to like redeem themselves through their relationship with capital to say, we are blood-sucking capitalists, but at least we're not Trump. And it'll work. That's the only difference, respectability and identity politics. This is why neoconservatism doesn't do culture war in the same way that like the hardliner Republicans do, is because capitalism doesn't want overt white supremacy. That's what capitalism is for, right? Capitalism is like a system that would, like a social technology that was supposed to encapsulate the violence of white supremacy and settler colonialism. It's that function that takes the violence and puts it in a way that's just the way society is. And through that system pushes down people because of those systemic racial biases, right? And the thing is that is okay for capitalism. But if you're doing overt white supremacy, overt anti-Arab racism, overt Islamophobia, that's not opening markets. That's not like globalization. You're retracting your like the potential of what your economy could be, right? You're pushing people away. And because of that, and because of the way that like the world actually works, you're essentially just setting yourself up to be redundant, like a redundant power eventually. Exactly. They want that BIPOC queer bag too. And the thing is that even in the places that are the most hardcore, like pro-capitalist, that are the blood-sucking of the blood-sucking places, it's not in the system's best interest in any of those places to allow overt white supremacy, because then it de-incentivizes engaging with that market. It's always just better. And I'm absolutely not in any way co-signing or saying that these are justifiable or anything. I'm just talking pragmatically as far as the way that they relate. It's always better for these places to use the systems of capitalism and all of the things that come with it to do the violence that they need to maintain their structure, rather than having overt racism, white supremacy, and things like that. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but I'm saying that's the function that capitalism wants, right? It wants to have capitalism do the bigotry for it, right? There's a great scene in Vice, the movie Vice, which is about Dick Cheney. One of the best movies, like, of our generation, in my opinion, as far as like explaining the American empire. But there's this great scene where Rumsfeld says something racy, I forget what it is. And as they're walking back to the office, Cheney says, we have a softer side to us now. We don't use our, like, the attitude, and we don't want to be as abrasive. And that's what the news channels are for, he says. And that's it. That's essentially it. That's that neoconservatism, because we don't want to say the crazy shit that they say, because then we're associated with that stink. So we would rather have those news channels that say the things that we want, like that we might want personally, which I don't even think Cheney is one of those people. But to get those people, those mouth breathers in your, like, political base, instead of, by not alienating them, you have things like Fox News and stuff, and you slightly associate yourself with that. But you always have that plausible deniability where you're saying, like, look, we're a government that we don't discriminate against everybody. We have, look, Colin Powell, we have Condoleezza Rice and Kamala Harris, right? So anyways, I've been way too long with this. I've been waiting for them to bring up the Republicans endorsing Kamala. But yeah, neocons and neoliberals overlap in their fake progressivism. And for the neocons, it's like an olive branch that they send out to hardline neoliberals, who basically, like, the only thing that keeps them from not voting Republican is, like, that progressive veneer. And so if you're able to have a Republican progressive conservative base that appeals to you, that isn't alienating trans and BIPOC people, let's say at least queer and BIPOC people, I feel like the trans thing might be a little bit too far of a reach for them. But still, they use their fake progressivism as like an olive branch to those centrists, pro-capitalists who need to have the progressive talking points to be able to live with themselves. And then the neoliberals do the fake progressivism because it's literally all they can do. They can't do anything besides be blood-sucking capitalists or do the fake progressivism or the other thing that they do is they externalize the far right to make themselves seem like a lesser evil. And that's the thing that now even the neocons are doing, right? The neocons are like, we want in on this because now we can redeem ourselves, right? Bush is for sure going to end up, he might have already, but Bush is for sure probably going to end up endorsing Kamala Harris. One former President George W. Bush has not endorsed Kamala Harris for the 2020 tour. For the presidential election. His office confirmed that he does not plan to make any endorsement or indicate how he or the former First Lady will vote. A spokesperson stated he retired from presidential politics many years ago. This stance comes in contrast to his former Vice President, Dick Cheney, who is arguably a more evil fucking blood-sucking scumbag than it's hard to even compare. But yeah, Cheney publicly announced his support for Harris, calling her a necessary choice against Donald Trump, whom he described as a significant threat to American democracy. Executive privilege, the thing that they used essentially to make Cheney be the king of America, essentially during the war on terror. That is not a threat to democracy, but Trump doing a coup with the stupidest people on earth. Yeah. Other prominent Republicans have endorsed Harris, but Bush remains neutral and has refrained from participating in the current political discourse surrounding the election. No endorsement is still an endorsement. Anyways, let's move on.
As we mentioned earlier, Adrienne is on assignment tonight. She is in one of those crucial swing states where she will be reporting and hosting tomorrow night.
This is Georgia. For decades, it was as red gets. Until 2020, when Joe Biden won this state, it became a swing state, and it became the epicenter for Donald Trump's bogus claims of widespread election fraud. That cloud hangs over everything here. Election boards have been remade, election rules rewritten, and the suspicious say maybe the point of all that has been to try to tip the scales in favor of Donald Trump. Trust here is shattered, and it's all playing out in the courthouses of the state. Courtrooms have become as important to the political parties here as campaign rallies. We will take you inside the fight for Georgia in the days to come on The Nation.